All right, let's jump right in, shall we? Today, we're taking a deep dive into Adbusters magazine.
Oh, Adbusters! A fascinating choice, and a perfect one for media studies students, especially for your A-levels, where you're grappling with all those big concepts, media language representation, audiences, and how the whole industry works.
Exactly. And Adbusters, well, they're not exactly your typical glossy magazine, are they? They're known for being a bit, shall we say, disruptive.
That's putting it mildly. Adbusters is what we media scholars like to call counter-hegemonic.
Counter-hegemonic. Okay, so for those of us who haven't brushed up on our media theory lately, what does that actually mean? Break it down for us.
Sure. Hegemony, in simple terms, is about the dominant ideas and values that circulate in a society. The stuff we often take for granted. The norms.
Like the idea that buying the latest gadget will make you happy.
Exactly. That's a classic example of a hegemonic message, often pushed by, well, you guessed it, the media. Now, counter-hegemony is about challenging those dominant ideas, pushing back against the mainstream. And Adbusters? Well, they've practically made it an art form.
So instead of airbrushed models and promises of instant happiness, we get dot what?
Yeah,
Disturbing images and thought-provoking slogans.
you got it. Adbusters wants you to think critically about the messages you're bombarded with every day, to question those consumerist desires that are constantly being reinforced. They want to shake things up.
And they do that through their very unique visual style, right? Like even the masthead, the magazine's title. It's almost invisible.
It's true. It's almost like they're trying to hide it, deliberately going against the conventions of magazine design. Then there's the imagery, often stark, provocative, even unsettling, and that black background. It's like they're saying, this isn't your average light read.
Definitely not your typical newsstand fare. So how do these design choices, this anti-aesthetic, as you called it, actually work to challenge the mainstream?
Well, think about those glossy magazines we were talking about. Bright colors, smiling faces, aspirational lifestyles. It's all designed to create a sense of familiarity and comfort, to draw you in, to make you want to buy into that lifestyle.
Right, it's like a carefully crafted fantasy world.
Exactly. But Adbusters wants to shatter that fantasy. They use this jarring visual style to disrupt those expectations, to make you feel uncomfortable, to make you stop and think.
It's like they're saying, wake up, don't just passively consume these messages, question them.
Exactly. And their approach actually has some deep roots in media theory. Roland Barthes, the French philosopher and semiotician, talked about this idea of countermyth.
Countermyth.
Yeah. He argued that by subverting familiar symbols and images, you could expose the underlying assumptions and power structures they represent. And that's exactly what Adbusters is doing with their design choices.
So they're not just being edgy for the sake of it. They're using those unconventional design choices to make a deeper point about the media and its influence on our lives.
Precisely. They're making us question those taken for granted messages that we're often bombarded with without even realizing it. And it's not just the imagery. Think about the layout of a typical magazine cover. Cover lines, teasers, the price, a barcode, all those signposts that guide you through the magazine. Well, Adbusters throws all of that out the window.
Yeah, it's true. It's almost like they're daring you to figure it out on your own.
Exactly. And that lack of clear direction, well, it actually connects to another media theory, Umberto Eco's concept of the open text.
The open text?
Yeah, an open text is one that invites multiple interpretations and encourages the reader to actively engage with the material. By stripping away those conventional signposts, Adbusters forces you to think critically and to come up with your own meaning.
It's like they're saying, we're not going to spoon feed you. We want you to work for it.
Right, and that's a very different approach from the passive consumption that mainstream media often encourages. It's about challenging those habits, those easy answers, and making you think for yourself.
So Adbusters is playing with our expectations on multiple levels, visually, structurally, and even intellectually.
Exactly. And speaking of intellectually, we can't talk about Adbusters without mentioning their love of bricolage and intertextuality.
Okay, hold on a second. Those are some serious media studies terms. Can you break those down for us?
Of course. Bricolage, in this context, means mixing and matching different elements to create something new. Think of it like a collage, but with images, text, and design elements.
Oh, okay. I'm starting to see it. Like they'll take a famous logo and distort it or put it in a completely unexpected context.
Precisely. And that's where intertextuality comes in. It's the idea that texts, whether they're written, visual, or audio, always reference other texts. It's like a web of interconnected meanings.
Okay, so it's all about layering those meanings, drawing on all these different sources to create something unique and thought-provoking.
Right. And it also plays into this idea of cultural capital. Basically, it's the knowledge and understanding of cultural references that you bring to the table. Adbusters definitely rewards those in the know, those who can decipher those layered meanings and get the jokes.
So it's like they're creating a community of savvy readers who are all in on the joke, a sort of alternative elite.
You could say that, but let's zoom in on a specific image to really see how all of this comes together. There's this one that always sticks with me. It's a Louboutin shoe, with the iconic red sole, but instead of a sleek high heel, it's attached to this. Well, basically trash. Like someone cobbled together a shoe out of plastic bottles and discarded junk.
Oh, wow, yeah, that's a powerful image. What do you make of it?
It's a brilliant example of what media theorist Frederick Jameson called cognitive mapping. It's about visually representing those often hidden connections between seemingly disparate things. In this case, the world of luxury fashion and the realities of poverty and waste.
So they're not just critiquing those who buy expensive shoes. They're highlighting the whole system that produces them and the impact it has on the world.
Exactly. They're forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truth behind those glossy images of consumerism. Now, it's important to note that even with their good intentions, Adbusters isn't immune to the pitfalls of representation.
What do you mean?
Well, take that same Louboutin image. While it's trying to highlight global inequality, the way poverty is represented through that makeshift shoe made from garbage could be seen as reinforcing certain stereotypes about developing countries.
That's an interesting point. It raises the question of whether even a publication like Adbusters, which aims to be progressive, can completely escape those problematic representations.
It's a reminder that we need to be critically analyzing media, even or perhaps especially media that we generally agree with.
So even when they're challenging the status quo, they're still operating within a system that can be tricky to navigate.
Exactly, and that's something to keep in mind as we continue our deep dive. But before we move on, I'm curious about your thoughts on Adbusters' approach to representing gender. I mean, it's pretty obvious they're doing something very different from what you see in most magazines.
It is, isn't it? You won't find those hypersexualized images of women that are so common in advertising and other media. It seems like Adbusters is more focused on systemic issues and how they impact everyone, regardless of gender.
You're right. They're not ignoring gender, but it's not their primary focus. It's almost like they're trying to move beyond those traditional binary representations of gender.
It's like they're saying, gender isn't the defining factor here. Let's talk about the bigger issues.
Exactly. And this is where feminist media theory can be really helpful. Adbusters is definitely pushing back against those narrow representations of women that we often see in the media. But by de-emphasizing gender, does this approach create new problems? Does it inadvertently silence certain voices or perspectives?
Again, another great point to consider. It seems like Adbusters is constantly raising these complex questions about representation and how we see the world.
And that's one of the things that makes it such a fascinating case study. It forces us to think critically about every aspect of media production, from the visual language to the underlying messages to the potential blind spots.
It's definitely not a magazine that offers easy answers. It's more about asking the right questions.
Absolutely. And that's what we'll continue to do as we explore who Adbusters is trying to reach with their message and how they manage to exist in a media landscape that's often dominated by very different values.
Speaking of reaching an audience, let's face it, this isn't exactly a magazine you'd see your average person reading on the bus. So who exactly are they speaking to?
You're right. This isn't exactly light reading material. Their target audience is likely someone who's relatively well-educated, probably middle class, and maybe a bit left-leaning politically. And this brings us back to cultural capital. Remember, it's about the knowledge and experiences that give you a certain status in society. Adbusters, with its complex designs and intellectual references, definitely caters to a specific type of cultural capital.
So in a way, they're both challenging and reinforcing cultural hierarchies. They're critiquing mainstream culture, but they're doing it in a way that might only resonate with a select group.
That's the paradox they have to grapple with. They want to disrupt the mainstream, but they also need to connect with an audience that's receptive to their message. And even within that target audience, people might interpret Adbusters in very different ways.
So how do we account for those different interpretations? How do we understand how the same message can be read in so many different ways?
Well, that's where Stuart Hall's encoding-decoding model comes in. He argued that media producers encode their messages with a certain meaning, but the audience doesn't always decode it in the way it was intended.
So you could have someone who fully embraces the anti-consumerist message, while someone else might just love the edgy aesthetic but not really care about the politics. And then there are those who might find the whole thing pretentious and elitist.
Exactly. It's a reminder that meaning isn't fixed. It's always negotiated between the producer and the audience, and that negotiation is influenced by a whole range of factors. Personal experiences, cultural background, even mood.
So even though Adbusters is trying to create a specific kind of community, they can't completely control how their message is received.
It highlights the complexity of trying to create change through media, especially when you're going up against the mainstream.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about how they manage to exist as a publication. They're a nonprofit. They don't run any ads, which is a pretty radical approach compared to most magazines. How do they keep the lights on?
It's a very unusual model, and it really challenges traditional media economics. Adbusters is saying, we're not beholden to advertisers. We're not driven by profit, which is a noble goal, but it does raise questions about their long-term sustainability.
So it's this constant tension between staying true to their ideals and actually being able to function in a capitalist system.
You got it. Their cover price is pretty high, which limits their reach. And their circulation isn't huge compared to mainstream magazines. It raises some questions about how viable this truly alternative model is.
They're trying to play the game without following the rules, which is a pretty risky move. But it's worth noting that they're not just a print magazine anymore. They have a website, social media. They've embraced the digital world.
Absolutely. And that digital presence opens up all sorts of new possibilities. For example, you could argue that their online activities tap into what media scholar Henry Jenkins calls participatory culture.
Participatory culture.
It's the idea that audiences are active creators and sharers of content, not just passive consumers. Adbusters encourages their audience to create and share content, to engage in discussions, even to participate in real-world actions and protests.
So they're using the internet to build a community around their ideas, which makes sense given their mission of disrupting the status quo. But even their online presence isn't without its contradictions, is it? I mean, they sell merchandise, right? T-shirts, tote bags, even with those anti-capitalist slogans.
You're right, it's another layer of irony. They're critiquing capitalism, but they're also participating in it, even if it's on their own terms.
It's like this constant balancing act.
Exactly, trying to find that sweet spot between staying true to their principles and navigating the realities of the world we live in.
Okay, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to touch on one specific issue that really seems to capture Adbusters' whole ethos, the post-West issue.
Ah, yes, the post-West issue. Published back in 2016, but it feels incredibly relevant to the world we live in now, this world of post-truth and alternative facts.
It's like they anticipated this whole shift in our media landscape.
They've always been skeptical of mainstream narratives, questioning those seemingly objective truths that we're often presented with.
So what are they saying with this post-West idea?
Well, it's about questioning those dominant narratives of Western culture. The stories we tell ourselves about progress, about power, about identity.
It's like they're saying, hey, all those assumptions we've been living with, maybe it's time to re-examine them.
Precisely. And it's a very different approach from the clear-cut narratives that we often get from mainstream media. Adbusters embraces ambiguity, open-ended questions, multiple interpretations.
It can be unsettling for some people, but it's also incredibly thought-provoking.
And it ties back to Antonio Gramsci's theory of hegemony. Remember, he argued that dominant ideologies become so ingrained that we don't even question them. Adbusters is trying to create space for counter-hegemonic discourse, to make us see the world differently.
But the question is, are they actually succeeding? Given their limited audience and their often complex approach, are they really making a dent in those dominant narratives?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's one we'll continue to explore as we delve deeper into Adbusters' impact and legacy.
Yeah, it's a tough question for sure, but one worth asking. I mean, Adbusters is really pushing us to reevaluate those narratives that we often just accept without question.
Right, and they do it in a way that's both intriguing and, honestly, sometimes a bit frustrating. You're never quite sure what their ultimate message is.
That's true. It's not a magazine that gives you easy answers. It's more about raising questions and making you think for yourself.
Which is probably why they chose that title Post-West,
Yeah.
right? It's like they're saying, we're moving beyond those traditional Western ways of thinking.
Exactly. It's about questioning those assumptions we have about progress, about power, about identity, the things that we often just take for granted as being true.
And it feels particularly relevant now, doesn't it? In this age of, well, what do we call it? Post-truth. Exactly. Adbusters was talking about this stuff long before post-truth became a buzzword. They've always been skeptical of those grand narratives, those claims of objectivity that we often see in the media.
It's like they're saying don't believe everything you read or see or hear.
Right. And that's such an important message, especially in today's media landscape where we're constantly bombarded with information from all sides.
So how do they actually encourage this kind of critical thinking? I mean, it's not just about the content, right? It's about the whole experience of reading Adbusters.
Exactly. The form is just as important as the content. They use this very distinctive visual style, the jarring images, the unconventional layouts, even the lack of clear direction. All of it is designed to disrupt those habitual ways of reading and make you think differently.
It's like they're throwing you off balance, making you question everything you thought you knew about magazines.
Exactly. And that can be a really powerful experience. It's about breaking out of those comfortable patterns of consumption and really engaging with the material on a deeper level.
So they're not just critiquing the content of mainstream media, they're critiquing the whole way we consume it.
Precisely, and that's what makes them so important for media studies. They're forcing us to think about the relationship between form and content, between the medium and the message, and how all of that influences the way we understand the world.
And they're doing it in a way that's both intellectually stimulating and, let's be honest, sometimes a bit infuriating.
That's true. They're not afraid to provoke strong reactions, but I think that's part of their genius. They want to spark a conversation to make us uncomfortable, to challenge our assumptions.
And in doing so, they're helping us to become more media literate.
Absolutely. They're giving us the tools to decode those hidden messages, to understand the power dynamics at play, and to think critically about the information we're consuming.
So Adbusters isn't just about critiquing the media, it's about empowering us to be more conscious consumers of media.
Exactly. And that's a message that's incredibly relevant for all of us, regardless of whether we agree with everything Adbusters has to say.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about Adbusters' place in the media landscape. They're a nonprofit, they don't run ads, which is a pretty radical approach. How do they manage to survive?
It's a tough road for sure. They rely heavily on subscriptions, donations, and merchandise sales. And the circulation isn't huge compared to those big mainstream publications.
So they're really going against the grain, challenging that traditional, commercially driven model of media production.
Right. And that raises some interesting questions about the viability of alternative media in today's world.
Can you really create meaningful change without playing by the rules of the system?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And Adbusters is definitely trying to find that balance.
It's like they're walking this tightrope between staying true to their ideals and actually being able to function within a system that often doesn't share those ideals.
You got it. And they're not afraid to experiment, to try new things, like their embrace of the digital world.
Right. They have a website, social media. They're really using those platforms to connect with a wider audience.
Exactly. And you could argue that their online activities really tap into this idea of participatory culture that we talked about earlier.
You know, it's funny because on the one hand, they're critiquing this consumerist culture, but on the other hand, they're selling merchandise.
Right. It's another one of those contradictions that make them so fascinating.
It's like they're acknowledging that you can't completely escape the system, but you can try to operate within it in a way that's more ethical and more aligned with your values.
And that's a tension that a lot of alternative media organizations are grappling with.
For sure. It's a constant balancing act. Now, before we wrap up our discussion of Adbusters, I wanted to touch on one more thing. Their focus on visual communication. They're really known for their striking imagery and their use of, well, we've talked about it before, bricolage and intertextuality.
Yeah, they're masters of visual rhetoric. They understand the power of images to convey complex ideas and to evoke emotional responses.
And they're not afraid to push the boundaries, to use images that are provocative, even disturbing.
Exactly. They want to make you feel something, to make you think, to challenge those easy answers that we often get from mainstream media.
And they do it in a way that's both visually stunning and intellectually engaging.
Absolutely. And that's what makes them such a rich and rewarding subject for media studies. They're a constant reminder that media can be so much more than just entertainment or propaganda. It can be a powerful tool for social change, for critical thinking, for expanding our understanding of the world.
And Adbusters is definitely using that tool to its fullest potential.
They are indeed. It really is amazing how they manage to pack so much meaning into a single image.
Right. It's like they're speaking a whole other language, a language of symbols and metaphors and cultural references, and you have to be in the know to really understand it.
Exactly, and that's one of the things that makes them so interesting for media studies. They're a perfect example of how media language can be used to create a sense of community, a shared understanding among those who are in the loop.
It's like they're creating their own subculture, a subculture of critical thinkers and cultural commentators who are challenging the dominant narratives of our time.
You could say that, and it's a subculture that's open to anyone who's willing to put in the effort, to engage with the material, and to think critically about the messages they're being bombarded with.
So it's not just about being smart or educated, it's about having that willingness to question, to challenge, to see things from a different perspective.
Exactly. And that's something that anyone can develop, regardless of their background or education level. It's about being an active participant in the media landscape, rather than a passive consumer.
And Adbusters is definitely a great tool for helping people develop those critical thinking skills. They're constantly pushing the boundaries, forcing us to think outside the box, to question everything we thought we knew about media.
And they're doing it in a way that's both visually stunning and intellectually stimulating. They're not afraid to use humor, satire, irony, all those tools of rhetoric to make their point.
And they're doing it all without running ads. I mean, that's pretty remarkable, isn't it? To be able to create a magazine of this quality with this kind of reach without relying on those traditional sources of funding.
It really is. It shows that there are alternative ways of doing things, that you don't have to play by the rules of the mainstream media industry to create something meaningful and impactful.
It's like they're saying, hey, there's another way, a way that's more ethical, more sustainable, more aligned with our values.
Exactly. And that's a message that I think resonates with a lot of people, especially young people who are disillusioned with the state of the media today.
Yeah, it's like they're offering a glimpse of what's possible, a vision of a media landscape that's more diverse, more democratic, more responsive to the needs of the people rather than the needs of corporations.
Right, and that's a vision worth fighting for, a vision that we can all contribute to, whether it's by supporting independent media outlets like Adbusters, or by creating our own content, or by simply being more critical and discerning consumers of media.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Adbusters, I hope our listeners feel inspired to continue exploring the world of media and to always approach it with a critical eye.
Yes, and remember, media literacy isn't just about analyzing texts, it's about understanding the power dynamics at play, the hidden agendas, the ways in which media can be used to shape our thoughts and behaviors.
It's about taking control of our media consumption and using it to create a more just and equitable world. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the thought-provoking world of Adbusters.
It's been a pleasure.